Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. Before we get started, if you enjoy this deep dive, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to click that notification bell so you never miss an episode. We're about to dive into a topic that's absolutely crucial for understanding how our planet really works: ecosystem dynamics. It's like exploring a city, but instead of buildings and cars, we're talking about plants, animals, fungi, all interacting and creating this delicate balance. And this deep dive is particularly relevant if you're a UPSC aspirant out there getting ready to tackle General Studies Paper 3. But it's also honestly fascinating for anyone who's ever wondered, how everything in nature is connected. So let's get to it. We've got a whole bunch of research articles and expert insights ready to go. And of course, joining me on this journey is, well, our expert in all things ecological. I'm glad to be here, ready to untangle the web of life, so to speak. Perfect. Now, when we talk about ecosystem dynamics, one of the first things that comes up is the food web, right? It's basically a map of how energy and nutrients flow through an ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a roadmap showing the connections between all the living things in an environment.
But it seems like sometimes we get stuck on the idea of a simple food chain, like this eats that, which is kind of oversimplified, don't you think?
You're absolutely right. A food chain is a very simplified, linear representation of who eats who. It's like a single street in a big city. It's a good starting point, but it doesn't give you the whole picture of how everything is interconnected.
Right. It's more like a single lane road when what we really need is a multi-lane highway. So that's where the food web comes in, right? It shows us the much bigger picture with all those complex interactions between species.
Exactly. It shows all those multiple pathways of energy flow and how everything is influencing everything else.
And all of that contributes to the overall stability of the ecosystem.
Right on. If you were to visualize the food web, you could imagine it like a diagram with arrows connecting all these different organisms. So at the base, you have plants. They're the primary producers, capturing energy from the sun through photosynthesis.
They're like the foundation of the whole thing.
Exactly. Then you have your herbivores who are eating those plants.
Plant eaters.
Yep. And then come the carnivores who prey on the herbivores.
Right, so the meat eaters.
Exactly. And finally, you have the decomposers breaking down dead organisms and returning all those nutrients back to the soil.
So it's a constant cycle. Energy and nutrients moving through these different levels of the web.
A continuous flow, but it's not just about who eats who.
Right, it's about the relationships between species.
There are so many different ways that these organisms are interacting with each other, and those interactions shape the whole ecosystem.
It's like a giant dance with everyone playing their part.
Exactly. And those interactions, they go way beyond just predator and prey relationships. We see competition where different species are fighting for the same resources.
Right, like food, water, shelter.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have predation, where one organism hunts and consumes another.
The classic predator versus prey.
Exactly. But it gets even more interesting.
Right, because then you have things like parasitism, where one organism benefits at the expense of another.
Yeah, it's like one is getting a free ride.
And commensalism, where one benefits but the other one isn't really affected.
A win-win situation. Think about bees pollinating flowers. The bees get nectar and pollen, and the flowers get to reproduce. It's a beautiful partnership.
It's amazing how nature has created these intricate dependencies between species. I mean, you realize that even the smallest interactions can have a huge impact on the whole ecosystem.
Absolutely. Every interaction matters. So to really get a grasp on this, let's look at some real-world examples.
Perfect. Because sometimes these concepts can feel a bit abstract, right? Seeing how they actually work in nature can really help, especially for our UPSC aspirants who need to be able to apply this knowledge to real-world situations.
Absolutely. So let's start with a really cool example that shows the importance of mutualistic relationships. Coral reefs, they're often called the rainforests of the sea, and they're built by these tiny animals called coral polyps, and they have this amazing partnership with these microscopic algae called zooxanthellae.
Coral and algae. That sounds like an unlikely pair. How does that work?
Well, the coral polyps, they give the zooxanthellae a safe place to live and the nutrients they need. In return, the zooxanthellae, they photosynthesize and provide the coral with food and oxygen. That's what gives them those vibrant colors.
So this partnership between these tiny organisms is responsible for creating these massive underwater structures that support a whole world of life.
Exactly. It's a partnership that's created some of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth.
Incredible. So what happens if this partnership is disrupted?
That's where things get a little scary. Coral reefs are facing a lot of threats, climate change, pollution, and overfishing. And all of that can lead to something called coral bleaching, where the coral polyps actually expel the zooxanthellae.
So they kick their partners out.
In a way, yeah. And when that happens, the coral loses its color and its main source of food.
It's like breaking a link in the food web. What are the consequences of that?
Well, you see a decline in fish populations, which can really hurt coastal communities that rely on fishing. And it also reduces biodiversity, which makes the whole ecosystem much more vulnerable.
It's a reminder that even threats that seem far away can have a huge impact on these delicate ecosystems.
Exactly. And it really highlights the importance of understanding these interactions, not just for academic reasons, but for making smart decisions about conservation and management.
Absolutely. So we talked about mutualism. Now what about commensalism? Remember, that's where one organism benefits and the other one is basically unaffected.
Right. Think about trees and epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants like orchids and ferns that grow on other plants for support. They're using the tree to reach the sunlight.
So they're getting a free ride.
Yeah. They benefit from the tree's height and the access to light, but the tree itself isn't really harmed.
A win for the epiphyte and a neutral situation for the tree. And this is pretty common in rainforests, right?
Oh yeah, rainforests are full of examples of commensalism. You'll find all sorts of plants and insects and even animals taking advantage of these little nooks and crannies provided by the larger trees. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about competition, which is something we all deal with in our own lives too, right? In nature, competition happens when you have multiple species that need the same resources, and those resources are limited.
Right, like there's only so much food, water, sunlight, even good places to build a nest.
Exactly. So species have to compete with each other to survive, and that can actually shape how they evolve over time, leading to special adaptations that give them an advantage.
Like those finches Darwin studied on the Galapagos Islands.
Right, exactly. Darwin noticed that the finches on different islands had different beak shapes because they had adapted to the specific food sources that were available on each island.
So the finches with the beaks that were best suited to the food on their island were the ones that survived and reproduced, passing those traits down to their offspring.
Precisely. And over time, that led to all these different finch species, each one specialized for its own little niche in the ecosystem.
It's amazing how competition can drive evolution and create such diversity.
Absolutely. But competition isn't always peaceful.
Right. It can get pretty intense sometimes.
Yeah, think about lions and hyenas fighting over a kill or different plant species trying to outgrow each other to reach the sunlight.
Survival of the fittest.
Right. Nature can be a tough place,
Yeah.
but all of that competition, even when it seems harsh, actually plays a role in keeping the ecosystem balanced.
So it's like a natural system of checks and balances.
Exactly. Competition prevents any one species from taking over everything.
Right.
It helps keep those populations in check and make sure that resources are spread around.
So it's all about maintaining that delicate balance.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about mutualism, commensalism, and competition. Now let's get to the interactions that might make some people squirm a little bit: predation and parasitism.
Those are the ones where one organism benefits and the other one, well, not so much.
Exactly. They might seem a bit harsh, but they're essential parts of the food web, and they really shape how ecosystems work. Let's start with predation, the classic predator-prey relationship.
The hunter and the hunted. It's something that's always fascinated humans, probably because we've been both predators and prey throughout our own history.
Indeed. And that relationship has shaped the evolution of both predators and prey. Predators develop all these amazing hunting strategies and adaptations, and prey species evolve ways to avoid being captured.
Like an arms race, each side constantly trying to outsmart the other.
Exactly. Think about a cheetah's speed, or a chameleon's camouflage, or a pufferfish that can inflate itself with poison.
Nature is full of amazing defenses.
It really is. And that constant pressure to adapt and survive is what drives the diversity of life on Earth. But predation is more complicated than it might seem at first.
How so?
Well, sometimes predators can actually benefit their prey in the long run.
Wait, really? How does that work?
By keeping the prey population in check, predators can prevent overgrazing or disease outbreaks.
So it's not always a clear-cut case of good guy versus bad guy.
Exactly. It's about balance. Predators help regulate the prey population, make sure there's enough food for everyone, and they often target weaker or sick individuals, which actually improves the overall health of the prey population.
It's like a natural form of population control.
Exactly. Okay, now let's talk about parasitism. This is where one organism the parasite lives in, or on another organism, the host, and gets its food from the host.
So the parasite is basically getting a free meal and a place to live.
Right. And unlike predators, parasites usually don't kill their hosts right away. They've evolved to exploit their hosts without causing immediate death so they can benefit from that relationship for a longer period.
It's a bit sneaky. But even though they might not kill the host directly, parasites can still cause problems, right?
Oh, absolutely. Parasites can weaken their hosts, make them more vulnerable to diseases or other predators, and they can even affect the host's ability to reproduce.
So they're not exactly harmless.
Right. And it's not just animals that can be affected by parasites. Plants can be hosts too. You have fungi that cause diseases in plants and insects that lay their eggs inside plant tissues, and the larvae damage the plant as they grow.
So it's another example of those complex interactions that are happening all the time in nature.
Exactly. And even though it might seem kind of creepy, it's all part of the natural world. Parasitism plays a role in regulating populations, driving evolution, and keeping those ecosystems balanced.
Okay, so we've covered a whole range of interactions from the cooperative to the competitive and even the parasitic. And it's clear that these interactions are incredibly diverse and complex, and they all contribute to creating this amazing web of life.
Exactly. And as we learn more about ecosystems, we realize that these interactions aren't just isolated events, they're all connected.
It's like a giant puzzle where each piece is important.
And when you change one part of that puzzle, it can affect the whole thing.
Right. And that's something that's really important to remember when we're thinking about environmental challenges and how to protect our planet.
Absolutely. Whether you're a UPSC aspirant studying for your exams or just someone who cares about the environment, understanding these ecological principles is essential.
It helps us make better decisions about how we interact with nature.
Exactly. So for our UPSC aspirants out there, let's talk about how these concepts of food webs and species interactions connect to your exam preparation.
Right, because it's not just about knowing the definitions, it's about understanding how to apply this knowledge in real-world situations.
Exactly. You might get questions about conservation, environmental impact assessment, disaster management, things like that. You might be asked to analyze the consequences of deforestation or pollution or climate change on a specific ecosystem.
Or to evaluate different conservation strategies. Or come up with solutions to mitigate the negative impacts of human activities.
Precisely. And to answer those questions, well, you need a solid understanding of how food webs work, how species interact, and how disruptions can impact the whole ecosystem.
It's about connecting the dots, seeing the bigger picture, and understanding that everything is connected.
Exactly. And for those of you who aren't EPSC aspirants, don't tune out yet. This knowledge is important for everyone.
Absolutely. Understanding these concepts helps us all make more informed choices in our everyday lives. From the food we eat to the products we buy to the way we interact with nature.
It's about becoming more aware of our impact on the environment and recognizing that we're all part of this incredible web of life.
Well said. So let's look at a case study from our research that really highlights how complex food webs and species interactions can be. It involves trees, epiphytes, and the animals that depend on them.
Right. This is a perfect example of how a seemingly simple relationship can have a ripple effect throughout an entire ecosystem.
Okay, so we're back to the trees and their little hitchhiking epiphytes. We talked about how that's a classic example of commensalism, where the epiphytes benefit, but the trees aren't harmed. But what happens when that relationship is disrupted?
Well, imagine what happens if deforestation or habitat loss occurs. When those trees are removed, the epiphytes that rely on them for support and sunlight, they disappear too.
And it's not just the epiphytes, right? The other organisms that rely on those plants for food or shelter are also affected.
Exactly. You have insects that feed on the epiphyte leaves, birds that nest in their roots, even small mammals that use them for cover. Their populations all decline as their habitat shrinks.
It's like pulling a thread on a sweater and the whole thing starts to unravel.
And those consequences can be really far-reaching. For example, a decline of insect pollinators like bees and butterflies can impact plant reproduction, even the crops that we humans rely on for food.
It's all connected.
Exactly. It's not just about protecting a few cute and cuddly animals, it's about preserving the whole web of life, recognizing that every species has a role to play.
Absolutely. And this brings us to a really important concept, especially for our UPSC aspirants, the idea of keystone species.
Right. A keystone species is a species that has a much bigger impact on its ecosystem than you might expect based on its numbers.
So it's not necessarily the most abundant species, but it's the one that has the most influence on how the ecosystem functions.
Exactly. A great example is the sea otter in kelp forest ecosystems. Sea otters eat sea urchins, and sea urchins graze on kelp. When sea otter populations decline, the sea urchin population explodes, and they overgraze the kelp forests, destroying the habitat for tons of other species.
So the sea otters, even though there might not be a ton of them, plays a crucial role in keeping the kelp forest healthy and diverse.
Precisely. And this concept of keystone species comes up a lot in UPSC exams. You might be asked to identify keystone species in different ecosystems or analyze what happens when their populations decline.
So it's important to understand that even small changes in the number or distribution of a keystone species can have huge impacts on the whole ecosystem.
And that's why it's so important to take a holistic approach to conservation. We need to focus not just on individual species, but on the whole web of relationships that support them.
Well said. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I want to leave our listeners with a few key takeaways, especially for our UPSC aspirants.
Great idea. As you continue studying for your exams, remember that understanding ecosystem dynamics isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about being able to apply those concepts to analyze real environmental problems and to come up with solutions that are based on science.
It's about recognizing that everything is interconnected and that our actions have consequences both for ourselves and for the natural world.
And it's about developing those critical thinking skills that you need to evaluate different perspectives, to weigh the pros and cons of different actions, and to advocate for policies that will protect our planet in the long run.
All right, so welcome back to the deep dive. We've spent this episode talking all about ecosystem dynamics, going from the basics of food webs and species interactions to the really important role of keystone species.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. So now let's zoom out a bit and think about how these concepts actually play out in different environments all around the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because every biome, whether it's a rainforest, a desert, or a frozen tundra, faces its own unique challenges when it comes to keeping things in balance.
Right. And that means we can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach to conservation. So let's start with a biome that's often called the most biodiverse on Earth, the rainforest. What makes rainforests so special from an ecological perspective?
Well, rainforests are just incredibly complex with this amazing array of species, all interconnected in this delicate web of life. You've got warm temperatures, tons of rain, and all that layered vegetation that creates this perfect environment for life to just explode. You've got those giant trees forming the canopy, then the understory plants all competing for sunlight, and then this incredible diversity of animals, insects, and fungi filling every little niche.
It's like a living, breathing tapestry.
Exactly. And every single thread is important. But as we've been talking about, rainforests are facing so many threats, especially deforestation and habitat loss.
So what are some of the consequences when we disrupt those rainforest ecosystems like that?
Well, when rainforest habitat is destroyed, we don't just lose trees. We lose all the life that depends on those trees. The species that need the forest for food, shelter, and breeding grounds, they're forced to move, or they might even go extinct.
And that can set off a chain reaction throughout the whole food web, right?
Exactly. It can impact everything from those tiny little pollinators to the top predators. And those ripple effects, they go way beyond the rainforest itself.
Right. They can affect global climate patterns, water cycles, and even the human communities that rely on those rainforest resources.
Exactly. Deforestation contributes to climate change, reduces biodiversity, and throws off that delicate balance in these vital ecosystems. So protecting rainforests, it's not just an environmental issue, it's a global imperative.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so let's switch gears completely and talk about another extreme biome, the desert. People often think of deserts as these empty wastelands, but they're actually full of life.
Oh yeah, deserts are teeming with life. But life in the desert has to be tough. So the organisms that live there have evolved these incredible adaptations to survive those extreme temperatures, that lack of water, and limited plant life.
Like cacti, with their water-storing stems and those spines that reduce water loss, or those nocturnal animals that avoid the heat of the day. Yeah, it's pretty amazing how life finds a way.
It really is. But even those desert dwellers are vulnerable to change. Deserts are facing growing pressure from climate change, desertification, and human activities like mining and agriculture.
And all that can mess with the balance of those desert ecosystems.
Right, absolutely. We're seeing soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, and even entire food webs collapsing.
It just goes to show that even the toughest ecosystems have their limits.
For sure. And speaking of limits, let's talk about the tundra, that vast treeless expanse way up in the Arctic and on high mountaintops.
Yeah, the tundra is a pretty extreme environment. It's known for freezing temperatures, permafrost, which is that layer of permanently frozen soil, and really short growing seasons. But even there, you find a surprising amount of life.
You do. You've got those hardy plants like mosses and lichens, and then those iconic animals like caribou, Arctic foxes, and polar bears. And they've all adapted to survive in those harsh conditions.
It's incredible how life finds a way to thrive in such a challenging place. But the tundra is also under threat from climate change, right?
Big time. As temperatures increase, the permafrost is starting to thaw. And when that happens, it releases methane, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas.
So it's like a vicious cycle. The thawing permafrost makes climate change worse, and that in turn leads to more thawing.
Exactly. And those impacts reach far beyond the tundra itself. They affect global climate patterns and the lives of people who depend on those ecosystems for their livelihoods.
It's all connected. So we've talked about rainforests, deserts, and the tundra, three totally different environments, each facing their own unique challenges. So what are the big lessons we can learn from all of this?
Well, one of the most important takeaways is that ecosystems are incredibly complex, and every part is connected to every other part. And when you disrupt one part of the system, it can have a domino effect on everything else.
And we're seeing those disruptions happening right now all over the planet. Deforestation, desertification, melting permafrost, it's all connected to human actions.
And it's not just about protecting those iconic endangered species, it's about understanding that every species plays a role in the web of life and that our actions have consequences for the whole planet.
Exactly. And that brings us back to why all of this is so important. Understanding food webs, species interactions, and keystone species, it all helps us make better decisions about conservation resource management and how to create a more sustainable future.
It's about recognizing that we're part of this web of life, not separate from it, and our choices matter.
So well said. Well, folks, that's a wrap on our deep dive into ecosystem dynamics. We hope you've enjoyed this journey with us and that you've come away with a deeper appreciation for just how interconnected all living things really are.
It's been an awesome exploration, and we hope you'll keep learning about these concepts and share what you've learned with others.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, and the more we understand about the natural world, the better we can protect it. So, until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those brains buzzing.